Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "Our treasure lies in the beehive of our knowledge. We are perpetually on the way thither, being by nature winged insects and honey gatherers of the mind." Welcome to Butter Living. I'm David Butterworth, and this is a podcast about health and about getting back to our playful roots. Speaking of roots, we're going to go deep into the roots of honey, into a world of bees, with a gentleman named Alex Taylor. Before we get going, I'd like to iterate to any listeners that we are not advising you to eat honey or do anything with honey, and we're not advising you really to do anything. But we are encouraging you to be creative souls in this imaginative existence we have, and experiment and try on things and wonder about life. If anything happens that you love or don't love, keep it yours and consider yourself solely responsible.
Do it.
Alex, welcome to our living room.
Thank you.
It's good to have you.
Excited to be here.
We invited Alex here today to chat about honey and just really go into a world of bees that I know nothing about, I'm curious about. He's a person I consider to be a master mead maker. Just the art that goes into that with him is just like mind-blowing. He's pretty humble about it. But I wanted him to be here today and talk a little bit about bees, and we might do a honey tasting. Is that right?
Yeah. I tasted through a few different honeys throughout the globe and see the differences in flavor and composition and color and smell and all that, really. So, yeah.
Awesome. So honey comes from bees. Bees are really fascinating to me, but I don't know much about them. You want to dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. I love bees. My grandpa has a big ranch in one of the biggest beekeepers in the United States by the name of John Miller, or Miller Honey Farms, has what's called his Frankenstein hives there on my grandpa's property, which at any given time consists of about 100 hives. And I just kind of grew up around the hives and was always fascinated by the bees, and kind of learned more and more about bees and honey, and have been kind of gathering literature and knowledge about that ever since. So, I think this passage in this book I like says it best. It's called "The Sacred Bee" by Hilda Ransom. It says, "From the dawn of human society, the nature and origin of the bee have awakened the curiosity and interest of man. For thousands of years, honey was the only sweetening material known, and it's quite natural that in ancient times, the little busy creature who produced this sweet food should have been regarded with reverence and awe." And, since ancient times and modern times, every time I see a bee, I kind of stop and watch it flying around and see what it's up to, and it just makes me feel good, makes me feel happy. So.
That's awesome. So, can you tell us a little bit about human history and bee history and how that seems to, in some ways, coincide?
Sure. Apparently, man has evolved right alongside the honeybee. Apparently, their fossil records, kind of come up together in the process of evolution. Early man were hunter and gatherers, so it goes to assume that since honey is one of the most concentrated forms of energy and sugar, that early man was looking for honey as a means, to eat and to get some good energy sources. Albert Einstein also has a very famous quote that says, "If the honeybee were to perish from the earth, human civilization wouldn't be too far behind it.
Wow. You mentioned in an earlier conversation with me, you were talking about the Egyptians and how they were honey gatherers and also people who revered the bee. Can you talk a little bit about the Egyptians in this?
Yeah, so what I was reading is that the Egyptian civilization was, lasted for a period of about 4,000 years. And all throughout their writings and their codexes, you can find imagery of bees, references to bees. The symbol for the lower gods of Egypt was in fact a bee. They knew the process of what pollination meant, and they're even known to have had barges that started with beekeepers that started north in the Nile, and throughout the season would go further and further south, pollinating all throughout Egypt, eventually ending in Cairo, where they would sell their wares at the end of that pollination process. So it goes to show that a lot of ancient civilizations were aware and capitalized on what the bee does and everything that it produces.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the bee and the honey process? For example, a bee goes out into the environment, and then where does honey come from?
Sure. Well, the majority of plants reproduce by the pollination cycle, right? The bee isn't the only pollinator, but what the plant tries to do is produce nectar to encourage the pollinator to come and thereby go and reproduce when it visits the other flowers. That's how plants like to reproduce. And the nectar, the plants make it sweet, so the insects want to come and benefit from the nectar source. Somehow the bees, which is the only creature that does this, has figured out how to turn that nectar into honey, whereby it collects the nectar, it stores it somehow, and then it takes it back to the hive, and some process kind of almost regurgitates or spits the nectar or the transformed nectar into the comb. And the bees do this is because during the winter they want to protect the hive and have as much food source as possible to survive the winter when there's no flowers blooming and nectar available. So that's kind of the process of how bees collect the nectar from the plants in order to create honey. Now, man isn't the only person or animal who wants honey. Everything from skunks to bears to raccoons to ants, wasps, most everything can smell that honey and is trying to get to it just like we are. So the bees have a ways of trying to protect their hives and put their hives in places where it's safe for them to have their home.
A couple things. I heard once that they do some kind of flapping with their wings to change the. Is it to kind of create some evaporation of
Sure.
of moisture from the honeycombs once they've spit the honey into the combs?
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that?
Sure.
Bit?
Yeah, honey is a very interesting process because, as we were just talking about, the bees gather the nectar and they take it back to the hive. The comb is, those little hexagonal cells that you see spread throughout, and the bees, they go and they spit the honey into the combs. At which point there's still too much moisture. So what the bees do is they flap their wings to get the moisture, to evaporate the moisture out of those cells. Once it's reached a certain density, I think it's between 13 and no higher than 22% of water content, that's when it's officially honey, and the bees go ahead and they cap the cells, the wax over. So if you've ever seen a honeycomb, what you have to do is you have to cut through those wax to get the honey to come out. So it was interesting. I brought some honey over to share with you, and my brother got me some honey from Cuba from a coffee plantation, and apparently that honey was harvested too fast because it had been fermenting in my cabinet, and I had honey spewing out of the cap and just oozing everywhere, and I hadn't been paying attention. So I've probably had that honey for 3 years, and now it just kind of smells fermented and alcoholic. And coincidentally, that's the similar story for the first known fermented beverage as being mead or honey wine, where the story goes that early man came across a tree trunk full of honey that had some rainwater and naturally fermented, and they drank it and became intoxicated, and those are the first people to ever consume an alcoholic beverage. It was by coincidence in natural processes.
So mead is like honey wine,
Yes.
and mead came before other alcoholic beverages. Is it theorized?
Well, it's theorized, but it's debated. The wine people like to think that they're the oldest. There's the beer people that think that there's records of people growing grain and harvesting it to make beer, but I think it makes the most sense to think of as mead being the most available.
So we actually, I want to direct listeners to this because you mentioned the fermentation process, mead making being like making basically alcohol out of honey, fermented honey. And we did a practice run at a podcast. We thought it'd be fun. You were in Auburn at your house, and I was at my house, and we did like a practice run podcast. And I want to post that because it's an unlisted video. We have it posted, but it's unlisted. I want to post that in the summary below our video today. And if listeners want to go to that one and watch it, they can. I mean, it's a real kind of shoddy attempt at doing like a kind of a virtual experience where we're talking about mead making, but I want to direct listeners to that because it is all about the mead making and what you do. I think as just a total mad scientist with making alcohol out of honey.
Sure.
And in that video, Alex shows us essentially his lair. I call it like his lair, like where he does his projects, with the cave, basically his cave where he stores the jugs, right?
Yeah.
Or the barrels.
Mm-hmm.
And he really goes into that. So I think that's a good shot at that if you want to explore that process a little bit more.
Yeah, if you want kind of an overview of the mead making process, why I think it's cool, and some different anecdotal stories about buried treasure mead, and some different adventures throughout that process. It might be worthwhile to go check out.
And it's possible that even in today's show, we'll get into a recent story about some buried treasure that you and your girlfriend went and dug up, right?
Yeah.
So maybe near the end, we'll talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, maybe I'll send you those photographs too if we want to link those up as well.
Awesome. Now, before we get into some tasting, because I'm actually just jacked that I get to taste all these different kinds of honey from Alex has been collecting honey from all over the world. And he's brought some of those today. I have no idea how to taste honey, like legitimately taste honey, so I can differentiate various qualities of it. I have no idea what that's about, so he's going to teach us a little bit about the tasting process. Before we get into that, I want to just ask him one question. In a conversation we had earlier, you mentioned that Well, you mentioned today on the show, you mentioned bears and humans and other animals trying to get into the honey. So bees want to keep these hives somewhere where they're hard to get to. But in an earlier conversation, you mentioned that there's a way to go about getting honey that's responsible, or
Sure.
I guess ecologically responsible, or humane, versus like an irresponsible way. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty vast subject, I guess, because you can really go down the wormhole of current monocrop farming techniques and all that kind of thing. I mean, what the big honey producers do nowadays is, here in California we have what's called the almond harvest, right? Where we just have these vast fields of just almond trees. That's all there are, okay? So when you do that, you essentially create a dead zone of pollinators, okay? There's only one tree that blooms in that whole area, for miles on end, and it only is providing a nectar flow for a handful of weeks, okay? So when that nectar runs out, well, there's no other species of plant out there to flow that nectar to create a good ecosystem of pollinators and animals. So what we rely on, and what our almond industry relies on, is for beekeepers to take their hives and place them in the almond fields for that window of time when the almonds are blossoming. And what people don't know is that beekeepers from every part of the United States are coming to the almond bloom, to help the industry, because they rely on the almond farmers are paying the beekeepers to come pollinate, sometimes as much as $200 a hive. So you have pollinators from Florida, North Dakota, from the south, here in the west, coming to pollinate the almonds. When the almonds are done, they pack up all their hives onto trucks and they go north to Oregon for the apple harvest. When the apple harvest is done, they put their bees on trucks and they go to Washington for the berry harvest. From there, they start traveling east. I think sometimes they're doing onions and carrots. And then from there, they all mostly wind up in North Dakota where the clover fields are. And that's a good place for the bees to what's called winter down. And all throughout that process, the bees are creating honey, and they're pollinating the fields. Okay. After that, what the beekeepers tend to do is steal that honey and replace that honey with corn syrup. So what the bees do nowadays, hopefully the responsible ones aren't doing all corn syrup. Hopefully they're leaving them a little bit of honey. But that system is creating a lot of stress on the bees by being moved around, and also by taking what they're naturally meant to eat during the winter and replacing that with corn syrup. So what we have now in that industry more and more is we see unhealthy bees. This year I heard reports of our almond harvest of having such sick bees. The almond harvesters are just saying to the beekeepers, bring us whatever you have. If it's a diseased hive, we'll still take that in our fields. We just need some kind of pollinators so we can, have more almonds.
Wow.
And the way that bees reproduce is that a wild hive, the queen from a wild hive, could be impacted by some of these hives that are going throughout the country, because the ways that they reproduce. Unfortunately, these unhealthy hives could easily impact the health of a healthy hive just by being in proximity to it.
Go into that a little bit. What do you mean? What do you mean, like a diseased beehive or a diseased set of bees being in proximity to a wild hive?
Well, when I say diseased, I should clarify that
compromised, maybe.
Well, the biggest impactor of the health of bees now is the varroa mite, and it's a mite that lives within the hive and reproduces within the hive.
Huh.
And at the time when the bee is just starting to start to winter down and whittle down its colony, is when the mite really explodes and takes over the colony right before the winter down process. So that's the biggest invader of the health of the bees currently. There's other things going on, but it's mostly the mite, and they're really able to get into if the mite's in the area, it could really jump onto another bee and infect other hives.
So if a health of a bee is compromised, or the whole colony is compromised in terms of its going about, and then the honey that's produced, is the honey produced also going to be less healthy? Like, so for example, we have these big producers or big kind of bee business people who are coming in taking this honey that's made from sick bees.
Yeah,
is that it's not good for the people who consume it either, right?
Yeah, I would not think so. Interestingly enough, almond honey from almonds is essentially useless. It's gross. People don't eat it. As well as, obviously, if you took a hive full of bees and put them next to the onion harvest, the bees don't really want to eat the onion bloom because it's kind of nasty. But if that's all you put them by, they will consume the nectar. But also, an onion honey is going to be pretty gross, as you can imagine as well. So, having said that, if you have a wild hive, you want it in a wild area where it has plenty of resources, plenty of available nectar blooms going on, and that's the ideal, hive and honey, where it's out somewhere where nobody's using pesticides or spraying, and the bees can kind of forage for the nectar sources that they so choose to have. Yeah, I brought a lot of interesting honeys today. Beekeepers might market a blackberry honey, right? You never really know. It can never be 100% blackberry honey, right? Because some bees might, want to go get some of that sage that's nectar that's flowing. So, but for the most part, beekeepers have a pretty good idea of what the source is.
Awesome. So Shaylin and I, my wife Shaylin and Bricks, and we get honey like locally. We're lucky enough. We looked on Nextdoor, and there's a guy who lives a couple blocks away. He's got bees in the backyard. He does it all himself. So can you talk to us about what's that operation probably look like compared to these big operations? So
Sure.
we got 2 pounds of honey in the cupboard from a guy down the street.
Yeah. They say if you want to have a hive, you should actually start with 2 hives in case one of them collapses, and then you could put some drones in the other one, or some bees in the other one, and they'll create their own queen. So that's a way to have 2 to kind of help each other out. Essentially, if you have a really good nectar flowing year, apparently one hive could produce as much as 100 pounds of honey. And that's when you see the one box and they start to stack them on top of each other. You want to have the queen in that small box, so the bottom box, and so she's just laying the eggs in the cells along the bottom box. And you put what's called a queen divider, so she can't crawl up into the upper hives and lay her eggs in those. So hopefully all your uppers are going to be full of honey.
Wow.
And then A good year, they say, responsible beekeepers can maybe harvest about half of the honey, depending on how much they produced. But it's a good idea to leave them with quite a bit of honey. In the spring, the beehive is small, and the queen will start laying eggs. From when it's laid to when the bee hatches is about 30 days. So at the peak of nectar flow, apparently the hive could swell to as much as 50,000 bees or more in a hive. And then as the nectar flow starts to diminish throughout the year, the hive will start to decrease its number and down to maybe 10,000 bees. And then before winter, they kick the male bees out, the drones or the kind of guard bees, because they're kind of gluttons. I guess they eat a lot of honey, so they get rid of the male bees. They're not invited.
Where do they go? They just
I guess they die.
They just kick them out. You're not.
And then they winter down. They seal up their hive naturally, and they all kind of stay in there, and they try to keep their hive at a certain temperature. In order to last over the winter time. So.
Wow. Okay, a couple things came to my mind before we get into the tasting. One, you produce. I want to know how much honey you use every year in producing mead, because you make mead. You use honey. How much do you use? Have you ever kept bees yourself? Because I think you mentioned that you've had some personal experience keeping bees, and tell us about that. Mm-hmm. And then another thing, if we can remember all these things, the hexagonal combs. Mm-hmm. Like, do we know why they're hexagonal? I think that's really interesting.
Oh, that's a good question. Sure. So as far as mead, I used to make so much mead, and what I do is about the way I make mead is I use about 3 pounds of honey per gallon of water, and I usually do about a 5-gallon batch. So each batch requires about 15 pounds of honey, which is quite a bit. And I usually make about 20 gallons of mead every year. So I'm going through about 60 pounds of honey just for my mead making endeavors.
Wow.
And I usually try to source my honey from McCullough Honey Farms, and my friend Patty at the Auburn Farmers Market usually gives me a pretty good deal because I give her the mead that I make from her honey, so she's pretty excited about that.
That's awesome. You brought some mead for Shaylin and I.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. Bricks can taste it even, maybe.
Yeah, maybe a little swill.
Yeah, so is that behind you there? Can you move your head a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we put some mead there on the shelf.
Sure. Yeah, I forgot this was back here. So this is called a berry melomel. A melomel is actually mead with fruit in it. If you hear the word metheglin, that's mead with spices added to it. If you hear the word sizer, that's a mead and a cider. So there's different names for it. And this was, I added blackberries that I foraged for. And it aged in this barrel that my brother got me. So anyway, I made the mead in 2018, and I bottled it pretty recently in May of 2019.
So you said you foraged for blackberries. You and your girlfriend go out, right, and forage. And
yep.
I mean, and everything you put in there. I mean, are you looking for the best fruit, the best ingredients?
Yeah, absolutely. I always try to, just put the best things. I already have the best honey that's pretty costly, and I want to just take the best fruit I could find. And if I can't, buy the fruit that I'm looking for, I'll regularly go out and forage it, mostly for berries and things of that nature.
Got it. And what about the hexagonal? Do you have any idea? Does anyone have any idea why they're? I just think I don't know.
That's a good question. I don't really know. I was reading a very interesting anecdote last night that was talking about kind of the history of bees. And the two bees we know of today are called the European bee, I think it's Apis melliflora is the Latin word, and there's the African bee, Apis africanus, I believe, and that's what you think of as the African killer bee, which is also kind of interesting story. But the two species are both honey producers, and obviously originate from their own continents. I had heard before that bees are not native to the Americas, at least the bees that we think of today. And one of the original North American, Native American word for bee also actually translates to white man's fly, because they actually, early Europeans brought the European bee over, I believe in the early 1700s. So that's the first record of modern bee in North America, and I think the first record of modern bee in South America is actually in the 19th century, which is quite a bit later.
Wow.
But what I was reading is that there is a version of a North American native bee that didn't have a stinger, but actually made honey. And what I was reading is that the comb would go into this big kind of bulbous thing, and it was almost, an early recorder of, I don't know if it was Columbus, but one of the recorders was talking about the structure of one of these early hives and how much different it was, because the bees would put the honey in these big kind of like egg-shaped cells. So it's I don't know. And then there's other records of cells in ancient times where I guess they would make a triangle shape. So it's almost like the shape of the cell has almost evolved a little bit.
Maybe like in terms of being the most stable structure,
Sure.
almost, or who knows?
I don't know. I mean, I think a hexagon, is pretty resistant. So
That's I don't know. That's really interesting. Well, I think it would be fun to get into some tasting. That was the reason we thought we could try to do this virtually, but we said, you know what? Let's just get together. Let's be in the same room. And so Alex brought a box of honeys. It must be in the 20s of different honeys. So I'll let Alex get that stuff together, bring it over here, and we'll kind of let him guide us as far as this tasting goes.
So honey, I mean, there's so many different nectar sources, right? So those different nectar sources produce different flavors when it's converted into honey. And depending on, when it was harvested, it might be more of a single source nectar, or if it was over a longer period of time, you might think of it more as like a wildflower where you couldn't really pinpoint the exact nectar source where the honey was coming from. In saying that, I think honey is endlessly fascinating. The different colors, how different it can smell. It could be thick in texture or very light and runny almost. They say, a good gauge, if you have a lighter honey, it was from a nectar source earlier in the spring. And if your honey is a little bit darker, they might have harvested it from nectar sources that were later in the year, just as kind of a general rule of thumb. So,
do we need to get a plate or a spoon or a honey stick or anything?
Yeah, we should probably. Do you have any toothpicks?
Let me check. And you can, if you want to get into any of that one, looking for some toothpicks.
So David said that I collect honey from throughout the world. So do my family and friends when they're traveling. I say, hey, if you see any really good honey, will you grab it for me? Some of the just most basic tasting honey that you might see is very clear and runny. It's usually clover honey. It's the most generic kind of form of honey. It's where a lot of our honey's coming from. I said is from the clover fields around North and South Dakota is where a lot of our bees, winter down, and it's where a lot of the beekeepers produce the majority of honey. So that's what a lot of people think of as that flavor and color when they think of honey. But there's all kinds of other ones. So hopefully we can get into that.
I couldn't find toothpicks.
Sure.
But I got some chopsticks. I don't know if that'll work.
Some of the most famous honey in the United States is called Tupelo honey. You might remember the Van Morrison song, "She's as sweet as Tupelo honey." Some people call it the champagne of honeys because of its color. It's supposed to be very light. That's how you know it's real Tupelo honey. And apparently it doesn't crystallize very well because I've had this for years. And it's still runny. So I think we could start off by smelling it, David.
Okay.
What do you think? What's the first?
I never thought I'd be doing this, by the way. This is so cool.
So this is called a honey flavor wheel. It's in my book, and it kind of helps you with some word descriptors of what you might find. The basic of those being warm, fresh, fruity, floral. It could smell spoiled, chemically, woody, or animal. What do you get for a smell there, David?
I want to say fruity or florally.
Yeah, I would go there. Almost kind of warm. Anyway, let's give it a try.
Okay.
These are actually some good. This is almost like a miniature honey dow.
Beautiful.
The reason a honey scooper has those ridges in it is so you can twist it. And really incorporate it.
I don't know if you can see that
into the. It doesn't drip. Another interesting thing about honey is that real honey is never going to drip. So you can see that it's always going to stay together. It's never going to drip. And then when it gets to the point where it wants to drip, it's going to globulate and kind of suck back up towards itself. So that's how you usually be able to tell if honey is real or not. So
can you put that on the background of the white? Maybe the white of the fire.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll do it. I'll do it with another one.
I think you could probably see it, but that is pretty fascinating.
So if you have honey from China or whatever, I don't know. A lot of that's been known to have been mixed with corn syrup, and it will have some weird coloration, and it will drip. What do you think about that honey, David? You try it?
Other than the fact that it tastes sweet and delicious, I don't really know what I'm looking for. It tasted really good.
Yeah.
To me.
You kind of see why they call it the champagne of honey, that back kick almost.
Okay.
It's pretty nice. This is kind of if you search around for Tupelo honey, you'll probably see this company, YS Eco Bee Farms. It's a pretty heavily marketed honey, as you can tell. It's got a lot of labeling and packaging. I don't know why it has a best buy date. That's kind of weird to me.
Is that kind of doesn't honey doesn't need to have a best
No,
by date?
honey does not spoil, so it should not have best by date. You probably eat this honey 100 years from now, and it's going to taste very similar as long as you store it properly and keep it out of the sunlight.
Is that proper storage? Out of the sunlight, cool, dark?
In a cool, dark place. Yep. And well sealed. Okay.
I'm going to plop this up here in case we want. I got some Parmigiano Reggiano. If we want some cheese to pair with our honey here.
Okay. We'll kick it with another lighter honey that's also very famous, but another part of the world. This is called acacia honey. Also supposed to be very light, almost white almost. And it's out of Hungary, and it's a very famous kind of honey in Europe, and very sought after. I guess the bloom that the acacia tree creates is just a very interesting honey.
Should we smell it first?
Yeah, I guess we should have smelt it.
We could do it like that, right?
Very different smell. There's a little ant in there.
Oh, nice. Yeah, way different smell. It almost smells a little earthy.
Yeah. Kind of fruity, but in a different way. This one's more granulated.
This is from Hungary.
Yep, this is wild acacia honey. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Also with the best before date on it. Honey should, as they say on here, should have no additives, no preservatives, and it just should be as least processed as possible.
That almost tastes, I want to say it has a crunch to it, because it crystallized a little bit.
Sure.
But I thought it was delicious.
All right, let's stay in Europe here. This is interesting to me. This is Italian chestnut honey. I've heard that the Italians, they think of honey very differently because this is their main source of honey. It's the chestnut honey. And it's extremely bitter, and I cannot eat it. It doesn't taste good to me. But I've also heard that the Italians, when they eat other forms of honey, say, oh, this is disgusting, it's too sweet. I want that bitter honey flavor. So that's just kind of an interesting thing. I got this one time and I tried it, and I'm going, what in the world?
So they've learned though that this is what it is.
Yeah, you could smell that, and your nose will tell you right away that it doesn't smell like honey. It smells almost medicinal to me.
Yeah, I was gonna say almost like a flavored cough drop or something.
Yeah. And I don't really want to taste it today, but I will with you, David, just to remind myself.
What does this? This tastes like something, a medicine I know.
The word descriptors under medicine here are plastic, turpentine, cardboard, and soap. The petrochemical words you could use are metal, cabbage, sulfur, ash, tar, tobacco. I don't think those.
I almost smell like a blueberry-y, hiding in there.
It reminds me of the smell of buckwheat honey. If you've ever had a very dark buckwheat honey, which is supposed to be very healthy, and also does not taste very good, in my opinion.
All right, let's taste this.
Let's give it a whirl. This honey, interestingly enough, is also quite old and has not crystallized. Man, I don't know why. So if there's any Italians watching, you want to throw up in the comments if my statement is accurate, or if you have any personal background on that. I'd love to hear some feedback.
I'm definitely gonna need some Parmesan. This at first I was like giving it a chance, and I was like, this is good. I was like, my first hint was like, oh, there's some fruity in here, and then it like hit maybe deeper into my taste buds or something, and I almost felt like I wanted to spit it up. I want to throw it up.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah, apparently they use it more in their cooking, I've been told. So it's not as like something they eat straight up. It's more something that they add maybe some bitterness to in their cooking.
Here's a napkin if you want to wipe
thank
here.
you.
Yeah.
I actually want a new stick.
Yeah, here. we have a lot of
I want
sticks
to
here.
taint my...
Cut you a piece of this if you want to.
Sounds very nice.
Is this a pairing that might go good with honey? I was feeling it when I went to the store today.
Let's stay in Europe. We're going to go to Scottish heather honey, which I also don't really like the taste of, but has a very interesting history. There's people from Scotland known as the Picts in historical times. I'm not exactly sure when. I want to say somewhere around 1200 AD was kind of when they were thriving. The Picts were almost like a small people. I don't know. For whatever reason, they were just small. There's a lot of old history and lore behind who they were. They were vicious fighters, and it took the Scots forever to kind of come and wipe the Picts out, and they're not around anymore. But anyway, the Picts were known to produce the best mead, the most intoxicating beverage around. And when the Scots were finally able to come and battle the Picts and have them on the edge of destruction, the last two Picts were, the leader of the Picts, the chief, and his son. And the chief is known to have, or thought to have, killed his son because he was the last person with the recipe for the mead, and he didn't trust his son to not give up the recipe. So the leader of the Picts killed his son and then died as the one knowing he was the last one for the recipe of the Scottish heather honey mead.
Wow.
And apparently the Scottish heather has some kind of interesting medicinal quality to it, which is why it made such an inebriating mead. So anyway.
Unreal story.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Ooh, I like the smell of that. It smells... caramelly, butterscotchy or something.
Jeez. God, this is incredible. Just doing this experience in general.
So long story short, if you have a honey that you didn't like, go try a different one. You might like the taste of that one. There's all kinds of different kinds of honey. All right, let's give it a whirl.
Yeah, this one smells like candy.
So I remember it tasted more funky than that. Let's try and mix it together a little bit.
It's so funny. Like, I feel like I could literally spoonful after spoonful after spoonful of this, and like the honey we got from our neighbor a couple streets down who keeps bees in the backyard. I don't feel like that at all. It's just local honey. Like I don't. But like you said, you spoke to, like, if you don't like one honey, try another honey. Like, they're different. I would put this on ice cream, sourdough bread, I would put this on any. Like, this is delicious.
Nice. That was your winner so far, huh?
So far.
Nice.
Yeah.
New
I'm sure it's expensive honey. No, I would. If you keep that open, I'm gonna keep eating it.
Alrighty. Let's move along here. Let's stay in Europe. This is just kind of a funny honey that I got in Norway in the airport in the city of Stavanger. And it's pretty funny because it says Stavanger Airport Sola was the first airport in Scandinavia to launch its own brand of honey in 2014. Beehives are placed along the runway, and thousands of bees take off and land here in pursuit of nectar from nearby flowers. The honey is harvested by beekeeper Kjetil Lise and bottled at KL Bee Farms in Sandnes. And it says that bees have to visit more than 2 million flowers and make 60,000 flights to produce 1 kilo of honey. And this says, here is the result from 5,499 flights.
Can we show the picture on the front of this?
Yeah,
this is just so cool.
And Norway is just such a pristine place, and just the water is so clear, and you just could imagine bees really liking that environment to produce some honey. And this is actually the creamiest honey, and I don't believe it's whipped honey, that I've ever come across.
Wow, what was the word you used? Globulate? Globulates right away.
Yeah, it's not really crystallized, but it's just very creamy and delicious. And I love the texture of it. Yep. Finish is very sweet, like you would imagine, like a clover honey tasting like.
I feel privileged to be able to dip in some of your honey stock.
David, I've been wanting to do something like this for the longest time, so thank you for doing it with me. I'm honored.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be doing this.
That one just so the creamy consistency and the sweetness and the fact that it's not really crystallized, given that I visited Norway 3 years ago.
It's almost to me like, not the taste-wise at all, but the consistency of like, from Trader Joe's. It's like a lemon curd kind of consistency.
Yeah, like a custard or something.
Yeah. Yeah, like that's the way it feels on my teeth. Almost.
I like that.
It was good.
Where should we go next here, David? This honey is interesting to me. We'll take a quick one. It's from Crete, or Kriti, if you're from Greece. It's marketed as the nectar of the gods. That's what the ancient Greeks thought of honey as. They thought of it as the food of the gods, and they revered honey in ceremonies and rituals, and they thought of it as this very sacred thing. And it's from thyme, wild herbs, and pine trees, is what it says. So I thought this was interesting. My Aunt Mimi bought this for me at a farmer's market when my mom was visiting Greece. And she said this is like the honey that you have to have from Crete, which is the biggest island in Greece, and I believe the most southern as well. And right away when you open that, it smells very good. But it's almost as like, maybe we're trying some honey as it might have tasted to them back in ancient times, or so I like to think.
Oh, that's cool. That one it almost smells tree-y or woodsy. I don't know.
I think so too. Some different descriptors under the woody would be dry, resinous, or spicy.
Resinous. That resonates with me.
Under resinous, you could refer to it as pine resin or propolis.
Didn't it say pine or something on the?
It says on the cap, from thyme, wild herbs, and pine trees. The nectar of thyme, wild herbs, and pine trees.
Wow.
Pretty robust flavor. I feel like the more darker your honey gets, the more flavor it's gonna have. Maybe some not as sweet, but a little bit more richness to it.
This one, rich, is a good word to me. Like when I right away when I put that, when that hit my gums and my taste buds, it was almost like it was asking me to say, notice this. Like it was the one so far that has like made an immediate impact.
Oh, really?
To my senses.
Huh. That's cool. Well, since you say that, I want to blow your senses away, really, then, with what I think is one of the most interesting honeys, and it's called Tasmanian leatherwood honey.
What?
And I'll read this description because it's amazing. It says leatherwood honey is one of the world's most unique and rare wild honeys. Our bees collect the nectar from leatherwood tree, a descendant of the ancient Gondwana forests that continue to grow in the remote World Heritage listed in the Western Tasmanian wilderness. An inherently organic product due to the isolated location of these forests and watered by the roaring Forties, long renowned for its extraordinarily piquant floral complexity and bouquet and flavor, produced with our passion and nature's integrity. So how I interpret that as these ancient forests going back, almost millennia. The bees are gathering the nectar from these ancient trees, and we could, kind of imagine or taste today, what something like that tastes like when produced into honey. So, it's very well. We'll crack it open. Let's see that knife, David.
Yeah.
Kind of want to gauge David's.
Yeah, let me get it.
Yeah, if you're interested to try some really strange flavors, smell some really funky aromas, find yourself some Tasmanian leatherwood honey. I want to say this is also a UNESCO protected.
It looks like paint.
Food.
And
smell that.
Interestingly enough, we pried it open exactly as we would a paint, right? A paint can. I almost went to the garage to get a paint can opener. Whoa.
Piquant, I don't know what that word means, but it's the right descriptor of what that smells like.
I'm strangely really attracted to this.
I almost bought 20 pounds of this leatherwood honey because I wanted to make some mead out of it. And kind of realized that it would be some pretty crazy tasting mead, so I didn't invest in it, but Maybe someday I'll make a small quantity of it and see what it tastes like.
Is this stuff safe to eat? Feels like it's gonna, almost like gluey. Almost like I'm eating glue. It tastes good to me. But it's still...
At the bottom, it's more of the... well, actually, maybe not.
The leather is still adhesive. It's like adhering to my mouth. Now it's adhering to my throat.
It's such a unique flavor. I can't describe. It's like a fruitiness mixed with like a weird animaliness, like hide or like a gamey flavor. Mixed with the aroma that kind of overpowers your senses. Need some cheese.
I got nothing as far as the description of the taste. It stays with me the longest because of the way it almost like grabs every part of my mouth and sticks to it. And I would keep eating it.
All right.
That's what I would say. That's amazing.
All
what
right.
a treat.
Australia, if you've ever visited there, as well as New Zealand, they produce some amazing honeys from some nectar sources that are very unique and interesting, probably because I've never heard of them. In saying that, the most famous Australian honey, you usually see it as eucalyptus honey. We don't necessarily need to try through these unless you want to.
I'm not stopping.
But here are a couple honeys from Australia. One is a plant called Viper's Bugloss. I'm not sure what that is. And the other one's called Northern Rakta. I'm sorry. These are from New Zealand. I'm misspeaking. These are honeys from New Zealand. So those are two kind. These are also... sorry.
This is great.
These are also 3 New Zealand honeys. My girlfriend's mom got me. This one is called Reweara. Can you pronounce that, David?
I would say yeah, no, I can't.
Okay. This is just a wildflower honey from the same company, Earth Diva, or I should say apiary. And then this is a honey called Waihi Gold. So all from the same company, but they're all going to taste a little bit different. So yeah, I like how honey's branded. I like the different jars and how people brand them. I like the descriptions. Generally, the less the branding, I think probably the smaller the producer is. So that's kind of an interesting thought. So those are all some kind of honeys. Some from some unique floral sources that I've never heard of, but you try through them and they're going to taste very interesting and very unique in their own right.
You got one there. I don't know where we want to go next, but you got one there that I've had my eyes on, and it looks like it's in a steak sauce bottle. Can you bring that one out here?
Yeah. This is my favorite honey ever that David, probably not coincidentally, had his eyes on. It's actually not in a steak sauce bottle. It's in a rum bottle. And my brother got this for me in Nicaragua. And what it says on it, it says, taken from Santa Rosa de los Paredes, community Lareñana, Larinaga, Leon, Nicaragua. And to me, it just smells like you're walking through a rainforest. And I love it, and it tastes very similar to that. So I want you to smell that. It's almost like it had rained, and the rainforest is like breathing all of its like dew out, and you could almost feel like you're transported to the jungles of Nicaragua. At least that's how it makes me feel.
It does feel yeah, like like in a real refreshing kind of way.
Yeah,
like that. It's not like I'm not in a rainstorm by any means. I'm just getting quietly massaged by a nice, gentle, tropical, light feeling. Yeah, like this is. Now I dip into this.
Oh my gosh!
And
I've tried that forever.
I dip into this, and it's like hard to poke in.
Yeah.
Like it's like almost like I'm poking into a bottle of sugar granules.
Sure.
What's up with that?
Usually, when honey granulates, the top usually has a layer of that stuff that didn't quite want to get granulated. So when you taste honey like that, and you taste the top part, it's usually sweeter than some of those granules down beneath. So.
Is it weird to say this almost tastes lemony?
No.
This tastes so sweet and delicious. It's so easy.
It's my favorite honey I've ever tried.
So easy. Like I think I said earlier, I could take spoonfuls of one of those. That one I could drink I could pour the whole bottle into a bowl and just go spoonful after spoonful.
Like a lemon curd or something, huh? What? Yeah, it's amazing. Another thing I think is obviously cool about this honey is that, I got this one jar, unless for whatever reason I go to Nicaragua. My brother was there on a surf trip. I'm never going to have it again, but, since honey does not spoil, it's the only food product in nature that will never go bad. Hopefully I'll have this for the rest of my life and be able to share what it tastes like with a lot of people and generations to come, hopefully.
That's amazing. That is refreshing. That is so refreshing to me. I think it's cool that then you've spoken to it a little bit, but that we can almost tap into the world of the bees in that location and the environment, and we're getting some of that in these tastes.
Sure, yeah. It speaks to the place, right?
Yeah.
Where it comes from, and almost how healthy the nature is there. And what's going on there. It's really cool. This is a really delicious honey my girlfriend got from me at a macadamia nut farm in Hawaii. It's a macadamia nut blossom honey. It's one of the most delicious honeys I've ever tried. It's not really marketed. It just says local and raw honey harvested on the Big Island of Hawaii. Bottled by the Honey and Royal Jelly Hawaii. So you kind of see here, this honey's mostly been crystallized, but when that happens, there's usually a little glob of non-crystallized floating around on there. And that's just kind of what happens usually. Usually when you try honey and it has been crystallized, if you want to do like a real tasting, you're supposed to warm that honey up a little bit so it's no longer crystallized, and try it that way. But I don't mind eating crystallized honey. if you do have crystallized honey and you don't like it in that form, you could always just kind of heat it up and it'll go back to its liquid form.
But not to a certain, like not too hot, right?
I would caution against heating up too much because it's going to scrub out those aromas and some of those good properties, that benefit us. So, want to try this one?
Yeah. Oh, this is almost like a jammy.
Sure. Yeah, as we talked about, nut trees, they do blossom, so you can find this macadamian honey. We already tried the Italian hazelnut honey, so the nut trees do blossom and have their own honeys as well.
So I don't know if it's because you've been saying, nut, talking about nut, macadamia nuts, and with the name of it, but it does taste nutty to me.
Yeah, I like this one because you can really almost taste like a macadamia nut richness in there, and it kind of does remind me of, the floral source reminds me of the actual product, which, is interesting to me.
That is interesting. Have you ever had like a macadamia nut in chocolate, like macadamia nut chocolate?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm thinking this maybe the sweet and the macadamia nut together is just kind of. This is like, by the way, to me, such a cool, almost ideal snack. I don't know if this is going out or not, but I'll just keep it the screen going dark there, at least from our vantage point. But this, like, having some cheese like this. Yeah. Some aged cheese,
it's really
hard cheese,
delicious.
And some this honey tasting is almost like we're in a dream. Like you talked about the Greek, like the food of the gods. Like I feel like we are two of the gods at the highest altar.
Yeah, we're pretty fortunate, pretty lucky, especially because I didn't really have to do a whole lot of work to get these honeys. The bees and the beekeepers did the work, and whoever went purchased it for me or myself, it gets to reap the benefits. All right, let's just try a few from Arizona that I got on a recent trip. I bought from a guy on the side of the road near the Grand Canyon, and that was in the springtime when the desert was really blooming. And I bought 2 kinds of honey from him. Sorry, I forgot the name of your apiary, but he's a really nice guy. This kind of is called mesquite honey, and it has not crystallized. And he said this was his best-selling desert honey.
When was that bottle, did you think?
2019. So this is the newest honey I got from this year. And he said it's just the most delicious honey, robust flavor, but has a very kind of clean finish without any kind of weird flavors jumping out, but just very rich and delicious.
It almost looks and feels when I kind of pour it around, not like I can slosh it, but almost like I could just pour it straight into my mouth.
Yeah,
drink it like a real syrupy.
Yeah, try that.
Try going like that?
Yeah, why not?
Like a maple syrupy kind of.
Just down it. That was awesome. Yes. All right, now we're eating honey.
Wow, this one's climbing. It just keeps going.
Kind of almost like buttery.
Oh my god. Yeah. Like a really rich, buttery, creamy, like. And it still seems to be getting better. To me. He was right about that being good.
Yeah. and it's just delicious.
I think.
And I want to try that in relation to this one that he also sold me. It tastes similar, but it's from a floral source called Cat Claw, which I'm not really sure what that is, and maybe some kind of desert scrub. Got honey all over my hands. So we'll try that and maybe compare and contrast the two if I can get open.
Don't forget to remind me, there's two things before we leave today. I want you to tell a story about, if viewers go back and watch like we said, the practice run we did at a podcast where Alex was at his home base. He talks about where that word honeymoon comes from. I think it's really interesting. You can watch that, but I want him to touch on that in this episode too. And then the other thing is the story about you and your girlfriend going and digging up some of the treasure that you had laid.
I'd love to tell those stories. Okay. Well, I guess we're not going to try the cat claw because I can't get it open.
Take a rip at it. Cat claw, too.
I know, huh?
I think you loosened it.
Oh. You didn't even try.
I'm sure you know how that goes. Like, if the person is doing all the work, and it's just easy.
Oh, yeah. So you take a smell of that. That to me almost smells like
Where's your smell wheel? Tasting wheel.
There's almost like
I'm not getting not getting woody in this one. Not getting fruity to me. Maybe a little tropical.
almost like a warm lactic.
What's that? I don't know.
Yeah, maybe if we warmed it up or something, because as you can see, this honey is completely crystallized. So maybe if you warmed it, you might get another.
When it goes into your mouth, because the temperature of our bodies, right? It's a little warmer. Does that essentially do what we're talking about too? If we warmed it up?
Yeah, I guess so. And part of your flavor is your nose. So what you're smelling contributes to what you're tasting. That's it.
Go ahead.
I don't know.
It's so interesting. I don't.
Yeah, it tastes way different than that other one actually.
It tastes way different to me. Also, and I'm not getting much of anything. It's almost bland. Is bland a word?
I guess so. I thought it was my memory is not serving me correctly on this honey.
Is it?
It's good.
I still want to say tropical a little bit. There's some.
Yeah, I guess it's.
Is it because of some of the richness and some of the robustness and just some of the, I guess, pure flavors of some of the others in contrast to that?
Maybe we're not cleaning our palates off very good, but maybe just how delicious this one was. This one maybe just isn't speaking to our palates as much.
It's interesting.
So yeah, those were two kind of desert style honeys from Arizona, mesquite and cat claw.
Desert. Yeah, it does taste kind of. I mean, I guess now that you say desert, it's kind of deserty.
So I think the last honey we'll try, we'll take it back to home. This is the beekeeper I always go to, McClaughley Farms. It's called Tahoe Blue. And how Patty markets this honey, she says it's 100% pure natural, high Sierra wildflower honey. made in the hive by bees with nectar they gathered from wild flowers blooming in the high country of the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. The hives are all located above 6,000 feet elevation near Lake Tahoe. This honey's pretty funny because the year before this, they're getting ready to harvest the same bees, and a bear had literally ransacked like 20 of their hives that they had up there and just tore through all of their hives and just made a huge mess of the whole thing. So it's pretty cool. They got to fight the bears off. Apparently they put these big kind of electric fences around their hives now to stave off some of the critters. Interestingly enough, there's a honey called sage honey. It does not ever crystallize due to its composition, and I think there's a lot of sage, wild sage up in Tahoe, and this honey's quite old and it has never crystallized, even though it's extremely thick and viscous, and I think it's one of the tastiest honeys I've ever tried, so I'll try that last.
I love everything about that. And this is like you said, this is the closest to home that we could go today.
Yeah.
This is what you use when you make mead, primarily, and this is Lake Tahoe, High Sierra.
Yeah, it's just fun to think about the bees collecting the flowers from up near Tahoe, where it's just so beautiful and it's so close to home. Go check it out if you've never been there.
Wow. And thinking about the bears too, wanting this. Like when we go camping up there, we're always wondering about bears. And
right.
It's such a picture that makes so much sense. Wow.
All right. It's been a pleasure, David.
Absolutely. You blew my mind, so to speak. I was dreaming about this when we were setting this up, but I didn't know how it was going to go, so you blew the expectations out of the water.
I like that honey because of its consistency. It has a very unique flavor right through the middle and kind of finishes. It's tough for me to describe the flavor.
It tastes. Is there such a thing as tasting warm?
Yeah.
This tastes warm, almost like it makes you feel good. Mm-hmm. Like it's, and I don't know, maybe we're just talking about home and stuff, but
it's almost like if I were to take a little swig of whiskey, you can almost feel it kind of trickle down. Yeah. Which is kind of a warming feeling.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. But yeah, I love this honey. I made mead with it once upon a time. That's delicious, and I have like 5 of these jars, and they each just have a little tiny bit on the bottom, and I'll always try to.
Got it. So I misspoke earlier. I said you use this primarily for your mead, but that's not necessarily true. You've used it sometimes.
Yeah, I use primarily this beekeeper, this company, McClaughry Farms, but not necessarily this type of honey because it's pretty rare and pretty expensive. So I obviously wouldn't want to screw this mead up. So I want to get some good water in there with it, some really good healthy yeast, and hopefully tastes good because I wouldn't want to spoil that much honey.
That's really cool. I like the jar too, the blue tint.
Yeah. So get out there. I mean, I love talking to beekeepers. Where do you have your bees? How are they feeling? How's the nectar flowing? And just talking to people and kind of get an idea of how they're treating their animals, how they're running their operation, and obviously just trying to support people who are in that industry because it's a tough industry, and they're producing do a lot of good things. So.
You mentioned in a conversation we had a couple weeks ago about the beekeeper who's conscious of his bees and talks with them and interacts with them just like they're a part of the family, and about just the idea that bees are real gentle and just amazing creatures, and they're not ever trying to, they're not going to try to hurt you. Can you speak to that? Just,
Yeah. First, that's kind of where I started this, was saying that, my grandpa had all these bees on his ranch, and, what's essentially hundreds of hives. And I was never stung by a bee growing up, out in the fields, being around the bees. They never bothered me. Maybe they're, whack me in the head flying back to their hive or whatever. But just how gentle they are, and, they're always busy. I like to watch the bees, gathering the nectar and the pollen. And they're just such cool creatures. That that's why I'm fascinated by them, and why humankind has seemed to be fascinated by them since early times.
And if a viewer wants to go back and hear more about like what got you into mead making, you told that story in that practice podcast we did, or whatever. I call it a practice,
Sure.
but just really the first one we got on virtual time with. So if you want to hear Alex talk about what got him into mead making and some of that process over the years of how he's honed his craft, and also why he doesn't want to market it, and kind of in a sense why he keeps it all about the art of it. Those are things we talk about in that other video that we'll link below in the summary of this episode. Before we close, I want to hear those two stories. I want to hear about Sasha and you going. I hope it's okay. I used your name. You guys are amazing. You guys going and digging up some of the treasure you had planted
Sure.
Many years ago, and then also the story about honeymoon. The word honeymoon.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Mead is honey wine, as we kind of talked about a little bit. It's a very ancient drink. Not many people know about it, but it goes back through the annals, of our time. A word we frequently use is called honeymoon, and people don't really. They know what a honeymoon is, but they don't really know where that word actually came from. And back in I guess medieval times, when two people were going to get married, what they would give them is a gift of mead, which would last them for a moon cycle. And a moon cycle is essentially, the cycle of a woman's fertility. So leading up to the marriage, not after, they were supposed to drink mead for a full moon cycle. And that would increase the woman's fertility, and some cultures also believe it increased the chances of them having a boy. So that's what's thought of as the word honeymoon, is that when two people were gonna get married, they would drink mead for a full moon cycle leading up to the marriage, which was thought to increase the fertility of the woman. So
I think that's so cool. And you said friends' weddings that you go to, that's usually a wedding gift?
Yeah, that's usually something that I gift my friends when I get invited. As I tell the story, and hey, maybe bring some of this on your honeymoon, and have a nice time. And if that's what you're trying to do, maybe increase your fertility, and name your kid after me when they're born.
You brought this for me and Shaylin. I'm not saying that this would make us have another kid, but and I'm not saying that we would name our kid Alex, but this is for us to drink, right?
Yeah, maybe just the middle name if you want to. Now another story. Let me grab this book real quick, David.
Yeah.
Where'd it go?
Are you gonna go into the treasure story?
Yeah.
So I'll just preface this with, this guy has told me about not just one time where he's laid mead treasure throughout the state of California, but he does it regularly. So if you're ever, I don't know, I think it's fascinating. It's like a treasure hunt. He's got treasure. He's got mead all over California. Just let him talk about it.
Yeah, this book, it's called The Complete Mead Maker by Ken Schramm. Thanks, Ken. You're the man. Hopefully you listen to this someday. It's like the Bible of making mead. So anybody who's interested, probably get that. In the back of the book is a story about buried treasure mead, which kind of inspired me to do my own thing. So anyway, I like taking hikes and going on adventures. And what me and my girlfriend started to do is to bury mead in places where we really like hiking and adventuring to. And we think it's kind of a cool way to kind of go back years later and unbury the mead and see what it tastes like, and see if it's changed, see if it's still there. And it's just kind of a fun way. I don't know. It's just kind of a fun thing that we do. But
so you said last weekend or a couple weeks ago you were up in Gualala. Can you tell us about that one?
Yeah. So we're up in Mendocino, in a town called Gualala, where we often go on vacation. And there's a hike through the redwoods down to the river that we really like. And about 3 years ago, we buried some mead there behind this tree. And actually, a couple years ago, we tried to go back, but the river was over the spot that we had buried it. So I was wondering, we buried it sort of deep, but I was wondering if it was still there. So we were there over the weekend, and we hiked up to this spot, and there was a chunk of the bottle sticking out of the ground with, mud or dry dirt caked all around the mead. So we unburied it, and we cracked it open, and we drank it there by the river about, I think it was 3 years later after we had buried it. And it was, it's delicious. And, we got to reminisce about, the time we buried it, and hang out and think about how cool it was that it was still there, and, just kind of enjoy each other's company and kind of reminisce on cool things that we've done together. So
that's so cool. This is the same. This is the treasure up in Gualala. I think when you first told me this story, before you untreasured it or undug it,
sure.
That I wanted him to write me a treasure map, and then I said Shaylin and Bricks and I were going to go explore and try to find it. But it looks like you guys did it first.
Well, we have another one up in Tahoe, in a meadow that we like near a waterfall that we go swimming. So maybe sometime I'll draw you a treasure map to that one and find the last ever existing raspberry mead that I made, I think in 2014.
Wow. So that's amazing. That'd be so cool. Well, I was joking with you a couple times about like even Bricks, like if Bricks grows up and he has all these treasure maps, like just what a fun thing for a kid. Or you were telling me a story. I don't know if we'll close with this, but you're telling me a story about someone who did this for his kids, right?
Sure.
Like he'd bury treasure, or maybe you can speak to that. But how cool it would be as a kid growing up and knowing that there's like literally treasure like hiding all over the place, and you just go on these expeditions to try to find it. Yeah,
part of me burying the mead was inspired by the story from the book, and also one of my dad's friends who buries treasure for his grandkids. That treasure being photographs of his adventures, a note to them, and kind of how much they mean to him at this point of his life. And also, I think he puts in like some Nevada silver dollars, which are quite, they're worth quite a bit, and they'll appreciate in value. And then he kind of leaves treasure maps for him, or for his grandkids to go explore these places at their discretion when they get a little bit older, into that age. So in doing that, it kind of inspired me. I thought it was really cool. Something that means something to me, and that I can go revisit and kind of reflect back on my own life, and then at some point, if I do have some offspring, maybe, start that process, maybe more geared towards them. So
that's awesome. That's so cool. All right, Alex. I think we've gotten into it, as you've said a few different times. Like you could go on literally for days about any like subtopic related to honey, related to bees, related to mead making. So maybe we'll choose another topic for next month and talk about that. But this has been amazing. Thanks for driving all the way out here to Davis and for sharing the morning with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. It was happy to come on here and talk about bees and honey and mead.
Awesome. All right. See you later.